Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day, depending on where all of you are. It's a pleasure seeing you again for our webinar on diplomacy in the 21st century. It's again a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of UPeace and UNITAR. Last time, we're first going to have a bit of an overview before we are going to dive deeply into a conversation. And like last time, kindly use the raise hand function or the chat if you'd like to contribute. If there are no major questions or queries regarding the format and the technical side, then I would say, Professor, you have the floor.
Okay, well, look, hello, everybody. I'm just now trying to see who we have in the room, and I see a number of very familiar faces. So, welcome all. I just want to say hello again and say I hope that you are finding the course valuable. I think from the energy displayed on the discussion forum that we have a really good and engaged group, and I have been enjoying working with you very much. If it is okay, what I thought I might do is start the meeting with some general comments about the progress of the course, which I've more or less articulated already, where we go from here in the remaining 3 weeks, then a brief introduction to session 7 and its readings, and then we can open up to a general discussion and look forward to Sabrina's moderating our engagement on that. So let me again express appreciation for your contributions to the discussion forum. I really think it's been quite an engaging few weeks, at least has been for me. A good mix of analysis and comment, and started with some very useful personal observations. We have now completed the second set of 3 sessions, where we looked in the last set at the different manifestations of diplomacy, bilateral, multilateral, and the various strands of non-state diplomacy. And I'm just about, I think, received all of your posts for the last of that set of sessions. We're now then turning to the last 3 weeks of the course, and in that we'll be looking at themes on the international agenda. Necessarily, it's a small sampling of the many issues confronting the multilateral system. And some of the choices, I have to admit, were made because they are issues with which I have some passing knowledge. But also, this being United Nations University, our focus will naturally be largely on the UN system and its related activities. But we must not forget the enormous amount of activity, multilateral diplomacy, other diplomacy that takes place outside the UN system. On the multilateral front, particularly from the World Bank to Interpol, for example, and from the G7 to the G77. Now, but as I said, this coming week, we study 2 international security issues, nuclear arms control and cybersecurity. And I'll come back to that in a moment. In our second week, we will take a look at the twin related challenges of human rights and the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. These are 2 hotly contested issues and primed with political high explosives, if I can put it that way. And in our last week, we look at the management of the global management of environment and development. with the evolution of the current framework, the Sustainable Development Goals. It happens to be 30 years now from the Rio Environment Conference, which was my first initiation into the world of the environment and sustainable development debate, which seemed to bring about a lot of the changes in the multilateral system that we are still dealing with today. But we'll come back to that. So that is our path to the end of the course. I look forward to your continued active engagement in the discussion forum and in due course to the receipt of your essays. And let me just make a couple of points on that. A friendly reminder to take careful note of the requirements for the essay as set out in the syllabus. The essay is to be a critical analysis of one of the five topics that have been set. A critical analysis, the way the syllabus spells it out. And I'm required to mark it in accordance with the 4 criteria which are set out there. And please note carefully the deadline for submission of essays, the requirements about the length of the essay, and the guidance on plagiarism and correct referencing and acknowledgement of sources. Sorry to go on about that, but it's better to be clear and not be sorry. Now, back briefly to the readings for session 7. Our first reading will be by Sergio Duarte, a Brazilian diplomat and former United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. The 50th anniversary of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was 2020. That was when the 10th NPT review conference was scheduled to be held. COVID delays and the meeting has been further rescheduled for later this year. Regret to say that the issues that Sergio Duarte identifies in his article as challenges remain pretty much unchanged, or situations possibly even worsened since he penned that article 4 years ago. So our aim from this article is to learn a little bit more about the NPT regime and learn that even the most successful international agreements, such as the NPT, need constant attention if their relevance and strength is to be maintained. Our second reading reflects more on the NPT review process. The article is by a veteran US diplomat and nuclear arms control specialist, Bob Einhorn, best known for his work on North Korea and Iran nuclear programs. And he is quick to accept that he was not very successful on either of these projects. Nevertheless, he remains a global authority on nuclear arms control issues, and I think you'll find his article revealing. Our third and last paper on the nuclear-related issues is by a former Egyptian diplomat, Ambassador Aboulanane. The focus of this article is the NPT-related demand for a weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. Not surprisingly, this is a long and contentious issue which circles around the issue of Israel's nuclear capabilities. So that's the nuclear component. We then also have a couple of readings to deal with the rather more recent question, but still very current, of the challenge to international peace posed by cyber threats. Now, of course, cyber threats are ubiquitous, from your bank account details to the protection of nuclear facilities globally. Our focus is the international security dimension. Our first author is Rex Hughes, a British analyst who speculates on how the international community might tackle global cyber threats. It was written in the wake of a crippling cyber attack on Estonia's internet infrastructure in 2007. But the paper remains relevant. cyber threats are currently in play, as you no doubt have heard, in the standoff currently between Moscow and Kiev. Our second article was commissioned by the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI. This article reviews the role of the UN Security Council in dealing with matters of cybersecurity. Not surprisingly, the authors are skeptical. The Security Council is not currently fit for purpose, so they find. There needs to be a critical mass of international effort and determination if action is to be taken on managing global cyber threats. The conclusion that critical mass does not currently exist. So those are the two mandated readings on the cyber issues. And there are some optional readings, and I won't discuss them now, and I suspect, given the amount of reading already on the mandatory list, you're not going to have time for them. But if you did have time for one, don't look at mine, go straight to Joseph Nye's paper called Nuclear Lessons for Cybersecurity. It's a helpful bridge to the forum topic for the coming week, which seeks to tease out the lessons from the nuclear domain into the possible future of a cyber regime, control regime. So, dear colleagues, enough from me for now. Let me pass you back to our facilitators, Sabrina and Marike, and hope you can guide us through our future discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor. Are there any questions, comments, remarks, suggestions? I see Miguel is already on it. Would you like to take the floor?
I have given my question. So because this bad relations, well, I want to talk about the relation between Russia and the European Union and OTAN and so on in these terms. No bad relationship now. So I don't know what will be the future. So my question is, do you think it will be possible civil limits in general treaty? Because this is the question in the last compulsory reading. But do you think that is possible that? Because if we analyze all the process about missiles, wow, so this is a treaty, but this was very difficult, of course, but we have it. So the negotiation on the treaty has been very difficult, but we have it. We have it, this treaty, but it's possible. Do you think? What do you think about this possibility? Civil limits treaty. So thinking especially thinking in war, of course.
Miguel, sorry. Hi, and good to see you. Which are you referring to a specific treaty?
Yes, a treaty about the civil attacks limit and the use of internet and cyber security and so on as an easy and a weapon for war. So it is possible to sign a treaty about this question.
Look, I think we should throw this open to the assembled group. Look, I mean, what have we seen so far in terms of the efforts internationally to control what have become generally recognized as highly undesirable and possibly even inhumane and unacceptable systems. And some progress has been made. I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question directly, Miguel, but what I would like to sort of suggest is that the multilateral system, particularly since the Second World War, has generated some constraints on national behavior, some important constraints on national behavior. If you take, for example, the nuclear one, which I know best, the case was in the 1960s, the expectation was that there could be 20 or 30 countries with nuclear weapons very, very quickly by the mid-1970s, early 1980s. And as it's happened, we've managed to contain that number to whatever it is, 8 or 9. So it's not, we haven't got rid of them, but certainly we've sort of done something to manage the extent to which nuclear weapons have become a fact of life and the extent to which their use has become acceptable. A rather more impressive achievement has been in the area of chemical weapons, where the Convention on Chemical Weapons is even more broadly accepted than the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Chemical Weapons Convention actually destroyed weapons. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty hasn't yet destroyed any weapons. Well, not completely true. It has destroyed the weapons in South Africa. So I have to clarify that. But that was an important achievement, to remove weapons from South Africa. But the Chemical Weapons Convention has removed chemical weapons from a big range of countries, including the biggest countries. So it's been a massive achievement. Biological Weapons Convention is less of a great victory because while pretty well every country adheres to that standard, there is no verification mechanism. So the Biological Weapons Convention is still a very powerful, I think, moral standard, but it doesn't have the force of the verification systems that the Chemical Weapons Convention has and the Nuclear Weapons Convention has, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has. So these are ways, I think, in which certain things have been achieved internationally, which could only happen through diplomacy and could only happen through a working multilateral system. We've stopped nuclear weapon testing in the atmosphere. We've stopped well, not stopped the use of landmines, but certainly very considerably reduced the use of landmines. There are some countries outside the Landmines Convention, but it was a mighty achievement. I mean, it was a big argument in Australia about that, whether the Australian government wanted to agree to a ban on landmines. But it was the soldiers who basically said, yes, these are evil devices. They're no good for the battlefield, and they're even worse when the battle's over. And so most countries of the world have signed up to it. There are a few exceptions, but and we know who they are, and they have their own particular problems, but by and large, we have got rid of landmines. Anyway, all by way of saying some things can be achieved. Whether what's going on in the Ukraine can be contained, who knows? And certainly the cyber activity in the European theater these days seems to be a very active area of almost violence. It's close to the threshold of violence. The case I mentioned, Estonia, the locking down of their facilities, and now it seems to be a major factor in the Ukraine situation. And so I think our topic for this coming week is very interesting. What can be done on cyber? It's immensely more complicated than the nuclear. nuclear by comparison is pretty simple. I don't have any special insights on cyber, but I don't think we should reject the possibility that some constraints can be negotiated and come to understood.
So you think it's very difficult cyber attacks and so on treaty. So today, perhaps tomorrow, we don't know.
If you believe what you're seeing and hearing, yes, it's not a very comforting situation, but there are some very important people saying some fairly frightening things.
In addition, I would like to draw everyone's attention to the links I just shared in the chat. One, of course, the Chemical Weapons Convention again, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In addition, I also included the Tallinn Manual, which seeks to be the tool for policy and legal experts on how international law, and thus also international humanitarian law, applies to cyber operations.
Thank you for the reminder.
Any other questions, queries? Yes, I think Chloe has a remark.
Can you hear me well?
Indeed, we
Okay.
can, Chloe.
Thank you. I was wondering for cyber issues, if you think maybe there is not public diplomacy, but maybe there are, as we have seen, like the track 2 or like track 3, like conferences. So maybe it's not yet like negotiated like a treaty, but maybe there are some rules that are established like customary law in international law, I would say. Is there something like this that could be already existing?
Yeah, look, this is not an area where I am really up to date, and as Sabrina has mentioned, there is already a certain measure of I wouldn't put it as consensus, standards, I suppose, out there that have been advanced. And there's also the question of how far existing international law applies in the cyberspace, and I think that's an argument which, again, it's not one I'm terribly familiar with, but others maybe in the group have some knowledge of. But the application of existing international law presumably does extend in some areas to cyberspace. But I think we are experiencing this immediate problem of the absence of really any clear limits, and this seems to be what we're experiencing now in relations between Russia and its neighbors in particular, but I'm not suggesting they're only ones that are acting out in this space, but this is where what we're hearing about most clearly now, and the possibility for using cyber techniques as a measure short of kinetic force to influence relations between states.
Any other questions or someone wanting to build up on that topic? Or on something else?
Or something else. But the situation in Ukraine is obviously sort of on everybody's minds at the moment. It's hard to get away from the fact that there's so many things going on there which are relevant to the whole question of the role of diplomacy and the management of the international system. And I did put a little note in the chat box today, mostly on the session 6 discussions, but referencing an article which appeared in the local Australian journal recently, which set out the range of levers that are in play in this state that we're now looking at, with the standoff between Russia and Ukraine, Russia, NATO and Ukraine, and the various elements of which diplomacy is one. And I still think probably, hopefully, the most important of all, but it's only one. And then there's things like cyber, there's things like economic pressures, there are things like, I forget the rest of them now, but there are 8 or 9 tools of force and pressure that can be applied in these situations. And it seems, if we're lucky, that diplomacy will be the one which helps us out of this particular crisis. Sorry, but I think I've interrupted a colleague with a hand up.
Christine, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Could you hear me?
I can.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Professor Tillemann. It is a pleasure to see you and hi, colleagues. In fact, I have not been very active in this course. I'm so sorry for that, but I do read I really like the readings. I read them, and I think I find them very interesting, and thank you for that. Addressing the question of cyber security, I think we have also to include artificial intelligence today, because I think artificial intelligence also will probably modify the way we conduct diplomacy and the cyber security questions, especially when we talk about autonomous weapons, drone killers. And today my question is, what is your thoughts about, what are your thoughts about how AI will modify the way the diplomacy is conducted today, and what is maybe the solution we can start looking forward? I know UNESCO is working on ethics of AI. It is already good, but how we bring UN member states to adopt and implement the AI ethics in their country and in their relations with other countries. Thanks.
Well, look, I think this needs another course. I'm afraid that AI is part of the new agenda that I think the world is going to be struggling with for quite some time. But the real problem is that these new agenda items are coming up so fast. I mean, it was cyber yesterday, AI today, and our systems don't seem to be able to cope with them in any very meaningful way. And so, I mean, I was born in the nuclear age, and that was sort of my coming of age was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I thought, hello, we may not be here tomorrow. Got to do something about that. And so I've been a sort of a follower of nuclear matters since that time, on and off, but more on than off. But we had how long to deal with this? You know, it's sort of it's now coming up to 70 years we've had of the nuclear age, and we're still grappling with it. But we do have some systems in place which are commendable. But these new issues, I'm afraid that the systems we have are not nimble enough to deal with them in a timely fashion. And it gets back, I think, to some of the issues that we've been canvassing in our course, things like leadership, things like the international mechanisms, the systems of diplomacy, the practices of diplomacy, the roles of states versus the roles of non-state actors. But the bottom line is that the systems are not capable of responding in a timely fashion, it seems. So the ones that I'm more familiar with, for example, like nuclear, or for example, like climate change. And climate change has been around as an issue since a long time, but when the first legal efforts were generated were 1992, and the Climate Change Convention. But that's 30 years in the making, and we're still struggling with how to make a decent job of addressing it. So I have to say I haven't got an answer to your question, sir. I think I do think we have to perhaps look at ways that the key players, if they could only understand that they have to take a lead because they have the technology, and they have to contain those genies that they create. And it is the same story again. I mean, you create a nuclear chain reaction, and it can be good or bad. And artificial intelligence can be good or bad. It's not the technology that's morally responsible. It's what we do with it. And yeah.
Yeah, so sorry, one more question. Between nuclear threats and AI threat, what do you think is more likely to happen to humanity today? Do you think nuclear has like the risk to have a nuclear war is more higher, is higher as in the past, or today what like democracies in the world can collapse just with AI because people can manipulate the elections, counting the votes, and also like what risk do you think is more likely to happen to humanity today in our 21st diplomacy?
Yeah. Look, I'd love to hear thoughts from others and from yourself about this. I really can't speculate. I mean, I have no. What I do know is the nuclear trigger, once pulled, could be a very instant existential experience. For the moment, I think other technologies and even cyber are still rather less than that. But it's not to say that they can't contribute. They interact. They're not separated threats. The threats are interacting. Probably climate change and nuclear, I find, is a link a bit too far for me to imagine. But between AI and cyber, these are not separated threats. They do become linked. And not a very satisfactory answer, I know, but maybe we have some other comments to contribute on this subject.
Sheridan, if you would like to take the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I think before jumping onto that question, when you're looking at cybersecurity, I think it's really important to divide it into two separate sections. First being cyber interference, which is what we talk about when it comes to election rigging or interfering with another government's democracy, and then cyber warfare as an entirely separate thing. I find that often when we're discussing cybersecurity, those two terms tend to get conflated a lot. So cyber warfare obviously aims more so at dismantling or disabling an adversary's military capabilities, but it works best or most efficiently when it's done in coordination with other military action. So if you take the case of Estonia, which is the one that's discussed in the readings, whilst that was an important case in terms of cyber attacks and understanding the influence that that can have, I think ultimately it ended up being a temporary nuisance that resulted in a heightened vigilance and security countermeasures in Estonia. And please feel free to tell me otherwise if you disagree with that. But then you take other instances such as the Russian invasion of Georgia or South Ossetia, in which Russia was able to synchronize the cyber attacks with major combat actions and allowed Russia to exploit the temporary strategic benefits of disrupting government communications whilst simultaneously launching the physical attacks. So that's a case where you have cyber warfare as being something that is very dangerous and has a tangible impact that you can measure. But cyber interference is an entirely different sphere. And when we're discussing what cybersecurity means, I think it's incredibly crucial that we distinguish between those two types and we avoid conflating it. You can't quite equate cyber warfare and cyber interference as being the same parcel. I think in academic work, they really need to be broken down a bit further.
Thank you very much. Professor, you have the floor.
I only say yes.
Sorry, I got a little bit off track. I forgot what I was originally trying to say. I wish there was an essay topic on cybersecurity, as I'm quite interested in it. But unfortunately, that's not one of the final essay topics.
Sorry. Now, there's a problem with the course with such a massive agenda that when you've got 5 topics, there's 5 topics. But no, but I think you're absolutely right, Sharon. This, from what little I know of the cyber debate and the literature on it, I mean, I think there's a clear understanding that there are differences between the domestic and international kinetic and non-kinetic sort of uses of it. And the problem is that the debate or the discussion is still so underdeveloped that the lines are not clearly drawn, and responsibilities and areas of people willing to take responsibility for things have yet to clarify, as far as I can see.
Exactly, and I think that's going to be one of the major issues if there ever were to be an international accord or treaty on cybersecurity. It's where do you draw these lines? Where do you distinguish between what counts as cyber interference and cyber warfare? When does an attack against one's voting process become something against more of a militarized institution or against the whole of government? And we're going to continue to have those problems for the next several decades, in my opinion, because it's an ever-evolving sphere where you can't just define a line and put it there. It will continue to move.
Agreed.
And indeed, if I may add, so the big issue is, given that you can't really distinguish between use ad bellum and in bello, given that you can send viruses which will only activate after a certain time, only in certain situations, you have a very, very different timeline from what you would have in the physical world, in the physical context. So here we are, as a lawyer of trade, we need to come up with solutions to technology which only very high level and specialized technicians can understand. So we are trying to legislate things we do not necessarily have the best overview of. So we are struggling in this entirely new sphere, pushing the boundaries. So apologies from the lawyers for on that side. There were additional questions in the chat. I would now first give the floor to Jihad, who asked something regarding also the forum discussion. If you would like to further elaborate.
Hello, and good afternoon here from Egypt. I was commenting about the same note that Professor John just mentioned about Ukraine and Russia, and the link about the article that illustrated the chart that highlights other points other than the diplomacy that can affect the conflict there. So I was just stating that it left me with few questions that I'm going to add to the forum in my comments. However, the main question is about how diplomacy can support in the time of crisis, considering the state's leadership different directions. Maybe in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, or maybe in general, it's okay. I keep asking myself this question, and I cannot find like what I can say, a solution or a direction to look for or to explore. So maybe Professor John, just help.
Hello, Jihad. Nice to hear from you. So if I understand you correctly, your question is to the question of global leadership in resolving issues like the one we're now witnessing. Is that what you hadn't?
It's more about the interaction between the how diplomacy can affect the situation, where the leadership of where the state's leadership are having another direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Look, this is why yes, and I passed on this little article today that you may have seen, which had this yes, and the various elements that are at work when it comes to a standoff of the sort we have now seemed to have reached, where diplomacy is only one of a number of factors that seem to be at play. And I thought this diagram was a bit scary. I mean, I don't accept it for what it is. It implies that all these 9 data points on the equalizer thing are of equal importance. But it doesn't, to my mind, quite work that way. I think what we're seeing now is something like we haven't really seen for quite, maybe I'm just too narrow in my reading of history, but there's a sort of grandstanding thing that really, well, reminds me of the Cuban Missile Crisis in a frightening way. And most of you won't remember the Cuban Missile Crisis quite so well as I do, but it was when, when Russia and the US were standing off about the emplacement of Soviet missiles in Cuba. And what we're seeing now is a similar sort of bit of power play, a serious power play, which has military backing, and it has all the threatening stuff of those other elements of economic threats, energy threats, cyber threats. They're all there in play. But the question is whether there is an intent to use military force at the bottom line, or whether a deal can be done to prevent that from happening. And that's a form of diplomacy, which is not something we've really focused on in this course at all. I mean, we've really danced around that point in a sense. I think I've a couple of times suggested that while we all are keen to think that diplomacy is really about solving global problems peacefully, there is this dark side of diplomacy where it is actually used as a Trojan horse for the use of force. And we would be a bit naive if we sort of pretend that that doesn't exist. And what we're seeing now is diplomacy in some of its darkest forms, where the diplomats are clearly working with a hand of cards which are given to them by a number of other agencies in the situation. But in each case, the hand of cards is held by, in the case of Russia, by one strong leader, and in the case of the US, by perhaps a not so strong leader, and then a range of other actors who have also their own sort of. So we're seeing a very interesting real life standoff of the sort which I don't think we've seen quite the likes of for some time. It's not pretty, but it does, if nothing else, underlines that diplomacy is not just about cocktail parties and getting votes for resolutions in the UN. There's a sharper edge to it.
Yes, totally agree. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
I don't know if I've gone anywhere near where you wanted me to go with that.
Yes, and actually, yes, I'm going to explore more, and because honestly, this is the first time I'm trying to fully understand the diplomacy dynamics, because I'm not anywhere near diplomacy. I am only related to the community development and social change.
Right. No, I've read your, yes,
yeah.
yes.
Thank you
but
very
you're
much.
doing important work, as I understand it, in
Somehow.
Egypt.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes. No.
Louisa had a question which was related to that, so I would first give the floor to her and then again to Miguel, if that's okay for Miguel. So, Louisa, you have the floor.
So yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Professor Tillemann, I just bouncing off of Jihad's question. You mentioned earlier that you grew up in the times when nuclear war was a terrible threat. I mean, as it still is. How effective do you think diplomacy is in, I don't know, preventing such a catastrophe when we have, in the event of a leader who just won't cooperate?
Well,
Did the doorbell ring?
Sorry.
So, Louise, if I understood, you're saying how relevant is diplomacy when we get to the situation where we are now?
I guess so. I mean, for one of our previous classes, I studied for one of the assignments the Munich conference and the concept of appeasement just prior to World War II, and that has been sort of brought up and again throughout military history as something we need to avoid appeasing and letting people get away with it. But yes, when things eventually break down, then what?
Yeah, well, okay. Yes, well, this is, again, repeating myself, I guess, that our course hasn't really gone into this in any way at all. And it so happens I'm at the moment rather late in life reading Kissinger's very fat volume on diplomacy, written in the 1990s. So, and it's actually interesting to read what he wrote then in the light of what's happened since, because I find a lot of the things he was saying ring truer now than they would have if I'd been reading it in the 1990s. How did I get to that? I'm not quite sure. But maybe the point was that the whole question of appeasement is much easier to criticize in hindsight, because at the time there were many countries that had very strong interests in avoiding war, full stop, and certainly avoiding war as long as possible. And there are bits of that history which I was never very familiar with, but one of the issues that struck me as very interesting in reading this Kissinger's account was that while Britain was suing for peace, it was desperately trying to get the Spitfire production, the fighter aircraft production up, so they might have a chance of actually being able to defend themselves if peace couldn't be achieved. And yeah, and of course this whole question of appeasement is now it's almost a textbook example, isn't it? When you think of Hitler's demands on the German majority areas of Czechoslovakia, as it was then, so the Sudetenland and whatever else. And now Putin saying, oh, well, the Russian majority areas of Russian language, I don't know about ethnic, language majority areas of Ukraine should be free to associate with us rather than be ruled from Kiev. Well, the challenge here is again, well, it's the number of challenges here. The world seems to have accepted that Crimea was a pretty sort of, well, was it really an integral part of Ukraine or not? Arguably not. It was a decision of Khrushchev in 1956 or whatever it was to make Crimea part of Ukraine. And the big issue at stake, I think, or there are so many issues at stake, NATO membership, all of that. But this whole situation is bringing to a head a whole range of issues that for quite some time have been more or less kept under wraps. Moving borders to allow ethnic minorities to move from one country to another is a huge principle, Westphalian. But the Westphalian thing was, you know, in a different age, different time. The borders was sacred. When the Soviet Union broke up, the big hope was across Europe, the decision would be keep all the borders as they were. Even when Yugoslavia broke up, it broke up into the constituent parts of Yugoslavia, more or less. So the original Federation of Yugoslavia became the separate states of Yugoslavia. And when the Soviet Union broke up, the separate parts of the the Soviet Union, the Federated Soviet Union, broke up into its separate parts. But now there's wanting to adjust around the edges. For the rest of Europe, I think that is probably old history which no one wants to repeat. And for other parts of the world, and it gets back to some conversations we've had on the discussion forum. If you look at Africa, Mohammed, I think in Kampala was saying, you know, borders aren't borders like you're thinking about in this part of the world. And so this is a global issue in a sense. What do borders mean? What are they? Are they sacred, or are they something we can adjust to the realities of life? Anyway, that's what's being tested, I think, at the moment. I've gone on too long.
No, thank you very much. It's very, very interesting to hear your perspective. Thank you.
Thanks so very much. Now, Miguel, you had a comment question in the chat, but also you raised your hand, so the floor is yours.
Okay, go ahead. So perhaps Crimea belongs to Turkey. So depends
Yes.
on the time in the history. Well,
Okay.
so this is a problem. I agree with you. This is a problem, but this is a problem from the past. So I think we have to think on the future. What is the future for this, for our work? Well, this was not my question. My question is, so talking about a different actor in diplomacy that I have not found in the readings. So I have given the question that I think is more clear, no? So secret services, perhaps they are not in the papers and in the articles because they are secrets also. But my question is, what is the role of the secret services in today's diplomacy? Analyzed, as I am saying that, so from an external observer, or as an external observer, the current problem with Russia, I think that the secret services are winning the game over diplomacy, aren't they? So the informations about the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, so some photos, some satellites analysis, but this has not come from diplomacy. This comes from secret services. What is the role of secret services inside the international diplomacy? So it's clear more or less my question.
Oh yes, yes, it's clear. Miguel, I mean, from my observation, it varies from country to country, and it hinges on the capabilities that countries have. I must say, I have a rather pessimistic view of the way nations, countries, states behave. And it's not a moral view, it's simply that when they have the capacity to do something, they'll do it, unless they're very strong constraints. So countries which have the capacity to monitor your telephone calls, and if they think that you're a person of interest to them, they will monitor your telephone calls. And countries that don't have the capacity, well, they have to deal with things differently. This happens to be something which has happened in Australia recently, where recently in the last 20 years, 15 years, where we were caught out our Secret Service caught out monitoring telephone calls of neighbours and worse, cabinet sessions. But if countries have the capacity to do it, they're likely to do it. And the only defense is not to do things in the way that you can be heard or, monitored. Not easy these days. Now I've gone down that road, and yes, the role of secret services. Well, so all I'm saying is, if you have countries that can afford and to have spies, they have spies, and other countries understand that they have spies, and so you have spy versus spy. I think that's all pretty well sorted out and balanced and sort of integrated into the structure of things. What is getting out of control now is not the human spies, but all the the spies in the sky and the rest of it. I mean, well, it's just changing the whole character of international relations. You don't need to have a spy satellite anymore for most developments. If you want to know what North Korea is doing at its nuclear power plant, you can get commercial satellite pictures of it every day, showing you exactly what's happening at that nuclear power plant, whether they're producing plutonium or they're not. And this has been monitored not by CIA, but by a nice little group in Monterey in California, where they take these daily pictures and analyze them and tell the world what's going on. So it's all back to all the developments of technologies, of invasive capabilities. I think, curiously, I suspect in a way that the role of the secret services as we used to know them, the human spies and the people who sort of monitored telephone calls and that sort of stuff, I think they're probably coming in slightly out of the picture, and then there's a whole new realm of intrusive technologies, many of which are in the public domain, changing the way we look at international relations yet again. So we're monitoring Russian tanks on the border, so it seems, if you believe what you're hearing, that they tell you from day to day whether the tanks have moved out of the camps and towards the border, or whether they've moved back, and whether they've got the doctors there or the medical tents, and well, this is a very complex and very well orchestrated production. I mean, it's a massive movie set all before our eyes, I don't know where I've come to there, but
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Given the time, I would just give Sheridan the floor because she has her hand raised and made a valid comment in the chat. So Sheridan, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'll try not to get distracted, but with my time zone, it is also getting quite late, so things are starting to fade a little bit. But Professor Tillemann, I'd love to draw on your expertise in nuclear non-proliferation and just ask that from the standpoint of someone who works with the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for non-proliferation, as well as someone who lives in Australia within the context that the Australian government refuses to support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as well as the recent AUKUS Treaty and the decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. What do you see to be the merit of the diplomatic work that you are undertaking to prevent nuclear proliferation? And how does your organization attempt to tackle these and continue to make progress in the face of an uncooperative government?
well, Sure, and I'm no longer with the government. So the first step we have to take is change the government. But apart from that, which is look, I personally am not a supporter of the ban treaty. I mean, I understand the motives, but I'm not I don't think the ban treaty is helpful. But this is a personal view. The organization I work for, the Asia Pacific, I used to work for, the Asia Pacific Leadership Network on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, it doesn't take positions as such very often. And it hasn't taken a position on the ban treaty, but it does encourage discussion and debate. In Asia Pacific, opinion is divided. Several of our ASEAN neighbors are in favor of the ban treaty. Well, they support the ban treaty. And of course, there's no cost to them to support the ban treaty. It's good in principle. If, as Australia is, and Japan and Korea, Philippines arguably, there is some reliance on the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States, then it's incompatible with the treaty. It's very straightforward to my mind. And, you know, until we can change those fundamental strategic relationships of dependence on a nuclear umbrella, then Australia and others in the region that do rely on that umbrella can't sign the treaty. And the same thing in Europe. Most of the NATO countries, if not all, have not signed that treaty. And I don't think, I mean, the treaty serves a purpose of upping the sort of moral ante on prohibition on nuclear use. That's good, but it's not going to get rid of a single nuclear weapon. There's got to be other ways of going about getting rid of the nuclear weapons. And I'm afraid to say it's not that treaty. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. And the problem is the fact that people believe, we've got a treaty now that says nuclear weapons are illegal. Well, they're not, unless you're a signatory of the treaty. But for those that are not signatories of the treaty, nuclear weapons are perfectly legal. It's a sad fact.
If I may go a bit further, then can I ask what you think are the most proactive, or I mean, perhaps successful isn't the word for it, but what kind of action can both individuals and organizations take to change the perspectives on dependence of that nuclear umbrella?
Well, I suggest support the Asia Pacific Leadership Network and APLN. Look, we need to keep the issue in front of governments around the world. In Australia, in Japan, in Korea, in China, in India, and Pakistan. You know, we have to keep the issue alive. And that was the objective of, that is the objective of our network. We've got leadership people in all countries in the region, and we're trying to help them maintain some measure of engagement with their governments to say, we've got to do something about this. We can't just continue to go on the way we have been. And you see, when every time there's a conflict in the Himalayas, you've got China and India pointing missiles at each other. India and Pakistan constantly. Not constantly, but every now and again. And the same thing in the South China Sea, where you've got confrontation between nuclear armed states over navigation of the South China Sea. Any of those conflicts could end up being a nuclear conflict one day. So whereas this is an old song sheet for me. I mean, whereas Europe, you have NATO and the old Soviet partners, now just Russia, with a whole set of ways of dealing with each other built up over a long period of time, including with treaties, some of which have been scrapped recently, but nevertheless, they had a way, and they have a way of managing their relationships. We don't have that in Asia Pacific. So Asia Pacific, to my mind, is the area of most concern for nuclear threats which are not being addressed in any coherent or comprehensive way. There are no mechanisms to deal with them. And that's why we have to do stuff in our region, in the Asia Pacific. For those of us from Asia Pacific, sorry about the rest of the world, this is where we need to do work.
Did that answer everyone's questions? Or does anyone have any last minute remark, comment, concern? Do something on a positive note? That the call for action for Asia Pacific?
I think I've been injecting too much Asia Pacific into my course, and I will try and bring some balance back for the next time, next iteration. But I think it is true that there's a real problem in which I've only really understood since trying to compose the course, that the literature is very much biased in a certain Western orientation, and still very much biased to an Atlantic view of diplomacy and great power relations and the rest of it. Whereas, in fact, there have been massive shifts, and the Asia Pacific region has not really got the infrastructures, the capacities, the expertise, the traditions of dealing with these issues in anywhere near as a coherent fashion as the Atlantic. And that's pretty scary. So anyway, we get back to our course next week. And I look forward to catching up with each and every one of you on the forum. And please don't hesitate to be in touch if you have any particular issues that need to be resolved.
Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you so much, Sheridan, for actually pointing out that as someone from the region, it's actually great to finally hear about it, as opposed to, probably the more Europe-centric view that we have in, unfortunately, quite a lot of academic literature. Though I hope that this is going to change in the future. Thank you so very much, everyone, for your participation. Thank you so very much for being here, even at the ungodly times for some of you. Thank you so very much, Professor, for all your insights. If there is nothing else at this point, I would wish you a great remainder of the day, a great next 24 hours at least, great week already. And we will be sharing this recording with UPeace as soon as possible, so it can also be integrated on the UPeace platform. Kindly let us know should there be any technical or further questions, and we would be very delighted to help you. With that, closing the recording and looking forward to hearing from you soon.